So today marks 12 months of riding motorcycles, and particularly my 2023 Honda CB125F. And it's a question that I've hesitated to really address before, but when you look up learner motorbikes, chances are the first thing that's going to pop up is a CB125. And the question I really want to address is it really a good learner bike? And I'm going to say no, it's not. So the reason I don't think this was a good learner bike is because of the area that I live in. I live in Regional Victoria, and as a rule the speed limits are generally higher, 80 to 100 to 110 kilometers an hour on most roads. And this is something that I think a lot of people won't either consider or realise when looking for their first bike. And it might be a common thing for experienced riders or people who are familiar with bikes in general, is that a 125 will not be able to go that fast. And I think living in regional Victoria, this bike is really not suited to the roads I'm riding on because of the fact that it really struggles to even hit, let alone maintain 100 kilometers an hour. Now, I think if you're living in a, metro area, metropolitan Melbourne, suburbs even, if you don't need to really hit above 80 k's an hour, this bike will be perfect for you. But living out in the country, it is underpowered to the point of being dangerously slow. This bike will often struggle to hit even 90 k's an hour in a 110 kilometer zone, and for a learner rider I feel like that's particularly dangerous. But I chose this bike understanding what its limitations were. I did a lot of homework before ordering this bike, and originally before this one was available in Australia I was looking at the older CB125E, which is, it's the older model, it's the carbureted version, and it was the budget learner bike. I think what's going to attract a lot of people to this bike is just how cheap it is. But if you don't understand the limitations of this bike, you could find yourself in a dangerous position on the roads. Living out in regional Victoria, you have to be prepared to get out of the way because the traffic is not going to be patient enough for you to sit 20-25 k's under the speed limit. Well, yes, this bike is capable of doing faster than 100 kilometers an hour. It needs a specific set of conditions to be able to do that. And ironically, that is Melbourne metro freeways and arterial roads. This bike on the freeway, where you've got the wind barriers up, 5 lanes of traffic, you can cruise at above 100 k's an hour all day long, and I've done it. But out on regional roads where you've got normal riding conditions, crosswinds, headwinds, the things that you don't have to deal with on an arterial freeway, this bike will struggle to maintain the speed limit, and that's what makes it dangerous, and that's why I don't think that it's a good learner bike. I think a learner should be able to experience being able to do the posted speed limit, and that includes up to 110 kilometers an hour. And I just don't think that this bike is particularly safe for regional roads. It really was a trial by fire for me, and when I first started riding, I was actually being more dangerous, trying to dive off the road in areas where it wasn't safe to let the traffic pass rather than just continue on my way. So I think if you're living in regional Victoria, you really need at minimum a 250, but I would say start with a 400. You need something that's going to be able to keep up with the traffic, and a 125cc is not that. This bike only has, by the book, 10.7 horsepower, and it is enough. It is enough to do up to 80 kilometers an hour, which brings me to another point. They describe this bike as a commuter bike, but in Australia the commute often means hitting the freeway at speeds up to 110 kilometers an hour, and this bike is not realistically capable of that. I think the reason that this bike isn't a good learner bike is that yes, it's very, very easy to ride, but your skills will plateau far too early. And in fact, when I sat my license test and did the on-road assessment, they actually had to make allowances for how slow this bike was because it wasn't mechanically capable of doing the speed limits, which was 100 kilometers up a hill in some sections. Now, I think if you do live in the suburbs of Melbourne or surrounds, pick your city, where your speeds aren't likely to exceed 80 k's an hour, I think this bike would be perfect. I think it is a perfect second bike, but as a bike you plan to learn on and get experience on, you're going to be very limited, because my biggest drawback as a rider is that I don't have enough experience at freeway speeds because this bike just isn't capable of it. Alright, so I've talked about the cons of this bike, and I'm not a list channel. I don't ever intend to be top 10 reasons why I love or hate this bike, but having complained about how it's dangerously underpowered, let's talk about what it does really well. Now, I've called this out before. I see a lot of bike reviews going, oh, these stock skinny tyres have no grip. And that is absolute rubbish. These stock skinny tyres have never once let me down. And I say that even though I crashed it last week. Because that was entirely my fault. I full throttled it in a patch of dust. These tyres have never really let me down. They've been reliable in dry, wet, gravel. I've even ridden across the top of Hotham Heights, Mount Hotham, which is one of Victoria's premier ski resorts, in winter. The road was still icy, and I did that at night. Which brings me to another good point. The LED headlight on this bike is better than most cars I've driven. It will light up 3 lanes of traffic wide easily, and then you put the high beams on. The visibility that this bike gives at night is phenomenal. It is fantastic. And even though it is recommended that an inexperienced rider shouldn't ride at night, this bike makes it that little bit safer because it's not a dull yellow glow that you have to contend with. You can see further down the road than most cars will allow you to. And I think that is fantastic, and it should be a standard for all bikes. Early in my riding journey, I was riding at night and came across another rider whose dull yellow headlight could barely let him see 100 meters ahead of him. It made me grateful that my first bike had a headlight that was capable of lighting up the road safely at night. I see a lot of complaints. People complain about the fact that the indicators are lit up permanently, and to be honest, it's not that bright. And if that little bit of light is distracting you at night, you've got bigger problems. You need to start focusing less on what's shiny around you and more what's happening down the road ahead of you. The same thing with the economy light. You've got a green LED bar that lights up on the dash when you're riding in economy or riding economically. If that light is distracting you, you can turn it off, but it's not that bright. And if it's distracting you, you've got bigger problems. The dash lights are really bright and visible, which is good at night. I think that if you're getting distracted by shiny things, you probably shouldn't be riding in the first place. I think that you learn to focus on what's happening around you, and you're able to tune out lights and reflections that are happening on the dash and at the front of the bike. So the other thing that I've often heard complained about this bike is that the mirrors aren't wide enough. That's rubbish. I mean, they're already wider than the handlebars on the bike. You can adjust those mirror stems out to compensate. And the complaint is, oh, I have to tuck my arm in and I don't like doing that. Well, if you don't like tucking your arm in, how are you doing your head checks? Tuck your arm in to see, move your whole body to the side. It doesn't matter. You've got to be able to teach yourself how to move your body on the bike. And this is, again, one of the good things about this bike is that it's not going to suddenly topple over because you shifted your bum on the seat to look in the mirror. It is a phenomenally easy bike to ride, and it is really forgiving. But I think what makes it easy is also what makes it limited. So I suppose I need to talk about the brakes, because I've had a few know-it-alls in the comments, and one in particular had claimed that the reason I crashed on dirt was because of the combined braking system. Now, this bike does not have ABS. It has, as I said, combined braking system, which is when you touch the rear brake pedal, it applies a percentage of force to the front brake. And the insinuation was that combined braking systems make the front wheel lock up, and that is absolute bollocks. You could jump on that pedal as hard as you possibly could, and it would not generate enough force in the front to lock up the front wheel. It's 10, maybe 20% braking force at full stomp. I haven't had enough experience on a bike with ABS to really compare it. All I can speak for is my experience riding a bike with combined braking. And when you press the rear brake, you can feel the slack in the front brake. And I'll be honest, if you're covering your front brake, you're not really going to notice the combined braking system anyway, because you're taking up that slack as you ride. I'm not going to get into trail braking because I'm not experienced enough to offer advice on that, but I do it, and I have done it since the first day, because I'm not afraid to use the front brake in a corner, because I'm not slamming the brakes on. If I need to slow down, it's front brake first. So if I don't think that this bike is a good learner bike, then why did I choose it as my first bike? Well, it's because I wanted something that was going to sip on the fuel. I have yet to see another bike on the market that can match this bike for its fuel economy. It is lightweight, which means it's easy to maneuver, which I mean more for parking and putting away than I mean on the actual road. I've dropped it twice and it has been easy to pick up, but I think that picking up a bike is a matter of practice more than it is brute strength. So I have been riding this bike for 12 months and I've done as close to 10,000 kilometers as makes no difference, and I love it. I love it. I think if you're considering this as your first bike, you need to understand its limitations. Yes, it technically can do 100 k's an hour, but the reality is, this is a bike that is not happy at anything over 80. I'm really struggling to think about what I can actually talk about this bike, because it's not really intended to be a bike review. It's just why I don't think it's suitable for other learner riders in Regional Vic. Well, I'm going to sign it off here because I've got well over 100 videos about this bike and I have run out of things to say about it, honestly. But if there is something that you would like me to cover specifically about this bike, let me know and I'll see what I can come up with. But the fact is that after only a year of riding, I'm still a really inexperienced rider, and my opinions should just be taken as that, opinions and not advice. I honestly believe that a 125 isn't built for Australian roads and you need something bigger. At least a 250, but at least a 400. Because this bike is slow to the point of being dangerous. Yeah, that'll do me. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.